Some individuals may come across as cold, distant, or hard to love, but in reality they are simply protecting themselves from being hurt again. Pain alters the way a person functions, and often no one notices. According to Jung, when pain isn't understood, it hides and manifests as behavior. In this video, we'll explore the behavior of those who've gone through deep suffering, why they act the way they do, and how to turn that unconscious pain into awareness. Stay with me until the end, as this insight might help you view yourself with less guilt and others with more compassion. Some people aren't cold, they're simply guarded. Others may seem hard to love, but they've just learned to doubt love itself. Certain behaviors, which society labels as distant, tough, or complicated, are actually survival mechanisms the psyche creates to protect itself from what once hurt too much. When pain isn't allowed to be processed, it becomes a defense mechanism. Over time, these defenses can look like a core part of who we are, but they are not. They are simply armor, stitched together piece by piece for emotional survival. Jung once said, "Pain is the currency with which the soul pays for more consciousness." He didn't romanticize suffering, but saw it as part of the psyche's expansion. Deep pain, when listened to with respect, can reveal not only our wounds, but also where we've forgotten to truly live. In other words, deep suffering shapes behaviors that don't always stem from temperament, but from the ego's attempt to keep the soul functioning, even under the rubble. People who have endured intense suffering develop complex psychological mechanisms that often remain invisible, even to themselves. The way they react, protect themselves, relate, or withdraw isn't random. These behaviors are structured in deep, unconscious layers, built to prevent the original pain from resurfacing. Judging these behaviors is like looking at a scar and ignoring the wound that came before it. But there's another way to see it, a gaze that doesn't ask, "What's wrong with you?" but rather, "What happened to you?" That gaze is the beginning of transforming suffering into understanding. It sees in behavior a clue, a code, a map, because the psyche communicates through symbols, repetition, and emotional patterns. Every reaction that seems over the top might be the echo of an old pain begging to be recognized. The wounded soul doesn't seek pity, it simply wants to be seen. Being seen with empathy is the first step for the ego to stop reacting on autopilot and to begin listening. When we understand that pain shapes us but doesn't define us, we can begin to unravel, little by little, the armor that once felt like skin. In place of that rigidity, a fragile yet real space appears, where awareness begins to touch what once only defended itself. Some pain doesn't disappear, it reorganizes itself within us. When it's not welcomed, it turns into living cores that keep reacting even when the threat is long gone. Jung called these complexes, unconscious emotional structures that have a life of their own. They aren't negative things, but defense systems that the soul built to handle impacts the ego couldn't bear alone. Picture someone who was deeply rejected as a child. It doesn't always have to be an overt act of cruelty. Sometimes it's just silence, absence, or looks that spoke louder than words. That unprocessed emotional impact becomes a rejection complex. Years later, this person might react intensely to anything that feels like distancing. A cold reply, a delayed message, a neutral expression. It's not that they're overreacting, it's the complex reacting. It's the wound speaking again with the same force as when it first opened. Jung said, "We all have complexes. The problem is when they have us. When a complex is triggered, it hijacks our awareness." The person enters an emotional state they often don't even understand. They might cry for no reason, lash out disproportionately, suddenly shut down, or feel immense emptiness over something small. These behaviors aren't irrational, they make perfect sense within the emotional structure of someone who has endured too much pain. It's common for people who have suffered a lot to spend years thinking they're too complicated, too sensitive, or too reactive. But the truth is that these complexes act like alarms. They go off when the unconscious detects that something in the present echoes something from the past. Even if the ego can't immediately make the connection, these emotional cores don't disappear by willpower. They shift when they are acknowledged. The process begins with a kind of inner listening. What in me is asking for care right now? Where is this reaction coming from? What is this pain trying to protect? Awareness doesn't erase the complex, but it removes its silent control. Complexes aren't flaws, they are emotional memories. And when we learn to hear them without fear or judgment, they stop screaming. They begin to whisper, and in that whisper, the soul begins to reorganize, not to erase what happened, but to create an inner space where pain no longer reacts alone. Instead, it is cared for. Distrust isn't coldness, it's survival. For someone who is hurt in the very place they felt safest, trusting again isn't a light gesture, it's a risk. A risk that the ego, in its constant effort to protect, learns to avoid. Even in seemingly safe situations, the soul stays on alert. The unconscious doesn't distinguish between what is happening now and what happened before. It simply recognizes the emotional pattern and reacts. This constant state of alert is an adaptive response to a world that at some point stopped feeling safe. It might come from betrayal, a broken bond, or a crucial emotional absence. The issue isn't how big the event was, but the psychic impact it left behind. Once distrust takes hold, the ego builds invisible defenses, interpreting looks, analyzing silences, predicting disappointment before it happens. If it can't find signs of danger, it often imagines them, all to avoid being caught off guard again. People living in this state don't want to live like this, but even less do they want to feel what once hurt so deeply. Distrust becomes a filter. The other person's words pass through it. Their intentions, gestures, and even their affection are weighed and tested. Everything is measured and often sabotaged, because believing can feel more dangerous than pushing away. Jung understood that the psyche acts out of protection, not malice. The ego distrusts because it learned that trusting comes at a high cost. But over time, that protection demands a price: the inability to experience true intimacy. Healing begins when we realize we're reacting to the past, not the present. When we recognize that the fear is not in the now, but in an emotional echo still pulsing inside us. It takes courage to pause that internal alarm even for a moment and ask, is this threat real, or is it a memory leading me? Trusting doesn't mean dropping all defenses at once. It means allowing small emotional reality checks. It means realizing that the present can be different, and the other person isn't responsible for the harm someone else once caused. There are moments when the world seems to collapse from within, trust shatters, bonds feel like threats, and pain becomes the only companion. In times like these, isolation isn't a choice, it's instinct. The wounded soul recoils like an injured body pulling away from touch, not to manipulate, not out of pride, but because any emotional exposure feels too dangerous, so it shuts down, builds invisible walls, and goes quiet. This withdrawal is often misunderstood from the outside. People see coldness, indifference, distance, but from the inside, isolation is a kind of psychic womb, a space where the soul tries to reorganize itself after being torn apart. It's in the dark, in this quiet space, that it tries to remember who it is now that the world no longer feels safe. Jung saw this inward dive as part of the symbolic process of death and rebirth. The shadow folds into itself, not because it's given up on life, but because it needs to protect itself until it can breathe again. Sometimes silence is the only language available to someone still learning how to name their pain. But what begins as refuge can, over time, become a prison. What was once a pause becomes a pattern. What was protection becomes chronic isolation. And then, what once saved starts to suffocate. The soul gets used to not depending on anyone, and the heart, still beating, lives locked behind doors no one has the key to anymore. Awareness can change that. There's no rush in the process, but there is a need for truth. It's about acknowledging, yes, I pulled away to survive, and also, maybe now I don't have to be alone all the time. That inner presence begins to soften the rigidity of the defense, and slowly, isolation can transform into solitude, a livable space where being alone no longer means being disconnected. That's when reconnection becomes possible. Reconnection with one's own feelings, with others, with life. Not like before, but in a more authentic way. Those who've withdrawn deeply know better when it's finally safe to open the door again, even if just a little. One step at a time. Some people seem unshakable. They speak with certainty, appear resolute, and walk like they know exactly where they're going. But behind that composed surface, there's often a story of pain. The pain of someone who learned far too early that vulnerability wasn't welcome. Psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott understood this well. He observed how children who weren't emotionally held would develop a false self, a protective layer that hid their true being, not out of choice but necessity. When crying isn't heard, the lesson learned is to stay silent. Years later, this dynamic turns into what Jung called the persona, the social mask we all wear, but which for those who've suffered deeply can become a golden cage. What was meant to be adaptation becomes identity, the control that once protected now confines, The question that echoes is, who would I be if I could just be? The persona itself isn't the problem, we all have one. It helps us interact socially, protect our inner world, and adapt to different settings. The trouble starts when we identify too much with it, when the mask stops being a tool and starts feeling like our skin. That's often what happens to those who've suffered too much. People who've lived through rejection, humiliation, or abandonment usually feel too exposed to reveal their fragility. So they learn to perform strength, to always appear in control, to act like nothing ever gets to them. But that image isn't the truth. It's just the shield. A shield that's often elegant, intelligent, functional, but lonely. Because the more rigid the persona, the more inaccessible the soul behind it. That's why wounded people sometimes come across as cold, distant, or even arrogant. They're not. They're just too guarded to let their walls down. The ego learned that showing emotion can be costly, that being too visible can be dangerous. So it built invisible defenses, rehearsed speeches, neutral smiles, automatic answers, all to keep the pain locked away where no one else can touch it. But the persona isn't invincible. It starts to crack when, at some point, the soul can't take hiding anymore. When loneliness becomes heavy, when the silence inside gets louder than the image outside, that's when something begins to shift. The question stops being, how do I seem? And becomes, who am I really? And that's where healing begins, not in eliminating the persona, but in weakening the need to hide behind it. Because real strength isn't about seeming invulnerable. It's about allowing yourself to be seen, even when you're still afraid. Not all empathy is born from understanding. Sometimes it's born from unresolved pain. People who've suffered deeply often develop an intense sensitivity to others' suffering. They pick up on nuances, sense emotions, get moved easily. At first glance, this seems like a virtue, and it can be. But when that empathy pushes past one's own limits and becomes a way of escaping the self, it stops being presence and becomes projection. Often those who feel too much for others are, in fact, feeling for themselves without realizing it. It's as if the other person's pain becomes a mirror for something within that hasn't been acknowledged. So instead of diving into their own wounds, they try to heal in others what still bleeds within. It's subtle, almost invisible, but it happens. They give too much, erase themselves, always step into the role of the caretaker. Over time, that becomes their identity. I'm the one who understands. I'm the one who handles it. I'm the one who holds others together. But behind that giving, there's often an unconscious attempt to avoid their own descent, because taking care of someone else feels safer than facing what's unresolved inside. Jung helps us grasp this through the concept of projection. When we can't deal with something inside, we project it outward. In the case of excessive empathy, we project onto others a part of our own pain. Yes, this creates connection, but it also drains us, because no connection is sustainable when it's rooted in imbalance. This kind of unrestrained empathy often comes with emotional exhaustion. The person feels drained, worn out, feeling more than they should, and almost always without realizing it. They build relationships where they give, and the other takes. That's not love, it's emotional codependency disguised as sensitivity. Healing begins with a subtle but profound shift. Understanding that feeling for others shouldn't mean forgetting yourself. That truly listening to someone else's pain only happens once you've learned to listen to your own. Helping doesn't mean carrying someone else's pain. It means walking alongside with awareness of your own limits. True empathy is born when the pain has already been acknowledged internally. Then, it becomes steady presence, just available, not excessive, not savior-like. It's the kind of presence that allows someone to feel understood without overstepping your boundaries. Those who've learned to care for themselves can be whole for others without losing themselves in the process. That's the kind of empathy that truly heals, quiet, humble, and deeply human. To love someone who's been hurt is never a simple gesture. It's not a lack of desire, it's an overflow of memory. Every attempt to open up carries the weight of what once went wrong, and even when the other person is different, something inside stays on guard. Affection comes but with armor, the bond forms but with vigilance. It's love wearing protection. This emotional caution is often mistaken for coldness, but it's not a lack of feeling. It's the result of a psyche that learned to guard what once bled too much. The fear isn't exactly of the other person, it's of what that person might awaken, the pain of abandonment, repeated disappointment, broken trust. So the heart moves closer with caution, and the ego, like a tired soldier, refuses to fully let its guard down. Jung understood that relationships are the stage where complexes act out most intensely. It's intimacy where unresolved wounds resurface. That's why people who've suffered deeply tend to love with a part of themselves still missing, always with one foot out the door, always with a silent escape plan. This stance might seem like protection, but little by little, it starts to erode the real connection. To truly bond, you have to allow yourself to be vulnerable. And for that, you must distinguish between what belongs to the present and what is left over from the past. The current partner isn't the one who caused the pain before, but the old wound insists on seeing everything through the same lens. Jung said, "True love begins where projection ends." As long as we're projecting our fears, our wounds, and our traumas onto the other, we can't see them for who they really are. The relationship becomes a battleground between what was and what could still be. And instead of freeing us, love becomes a source of tension. Healing in this space is gradual. It takes presence, deep listening, and honest self-reflection. You have to ask yourself, am I reacting to what's happening now or to what happened before? Trust isn't about diving in all at once. It's about slowly realizing there are safe places, that not all love hurts, that it's possible to love without losing yourself, and trust without vanishing. When that begins to happen, the armor doesn't need to be ripped off, it simply becomes unnecessary. Some people carry the weight of the world in silence. They don't ask for help, don't complain, don't show weakness. They're seen as strong, resilient, the ones who can handle anything. But often that strength wasn't a choice, it was the absence of one. When no one was around, the soul had to learn to walk alone, and it did. The strength of someone who suffered deeply has deep roots. It's not loud, not made of grand words or displays of confidence. It's a strength born from the exhaustion of falling and still getting up, from the constant fear of collapsing and the need to stay upright anyway. It's a quiet strength, but solid, a structure built with effort, pain, and persistence. Jung understood that in many cases, suffering activates a spontaneous search for the self, the deepest core of the psyche. When everything outside seems to fall apart, something inside insists on continuing. That something is what holds the soul when the ego can no longer manage. It's what whispers, "Keep going," when there's no evidence that a path remains. But that strength, when it finds no space to be balanced with affection and care, becomes rigid. The soul, having learned to endure, begins to lose its ability to surrender. It hardens. It becomes armor, not just against others, but also against itself. Because showing pain after so long, holding everything in alone, feels almost like a betrayal of the journey. That's why true strength needs to walk alongside vulnerability. Being strong doesn't mean never needing anyone. It means knowing when you can finally rest in someone's safety. It means being able to say, "I can't take this anymore," without fear of falling apart. It means trusting that strength can also be gentle. When the soul realizes it doesn't need to fight all the time anymore, a new kind of strength emerges. Not survival strength, but conscious strength. The kind that lets you carry your story without hardening inside it. The kind that knows the value of every scar, but no longer needs them as proof. And that's when the path stops being lonely, even if it's still quiet. Some people live more in their head than in their body. They think all the time, analyze every gesture, replay old conversations, project future possibilities. It's like the mind never shuts off. At first glance, it looks like intelligence, but often it's just fear in disguise. Overthinking can be a sophisticated way of avoiding feeling. For those who've suffered deeply, the emotional world can seem too unstable. Feeling, when tied to intense pain, becomes a threat. So the ego finds a solution. It transfers everything to the rational realm. The mind becomes a shelter, a control zone, the place where everything can be predicted, explained, understood. But in this pursuit of control, emotional spontaneity begins to fade. Jung warned that knowledge alone doesn't transform. He said, "Knowing is not enough. We must live, and living means feeling, even when it hurts." Excessive reflection is the ego's strategy to keep pain suspended, but what isn't felt can't be integrated, and what isn't integrated continues to act in the shadows. It's common for people who overthink to struggle with naming their emotions. They know what's happening, can explain the reason, recognize the pattern, yet remain stuck in the same place. That's because analysis without emotional acknowledgement becomes a loop, a constant spin between understanding and blockage. Thinking feels safe, feeling doesn't. That's the unconscious logic. But the paradox is that only feeling brings transformation. Only when pain passes through the body, not just the mind, does it find a place to rest. And that doesn't mean drowning in suffering, but allowing yourself to be present with what is, without hiding behind arguments. Healing doesn't mean thinking less. It means creating space for thought to walk alongside emotion. It's letting the body speak, letting the tears come, letting silence settle without needing immediate explanation. That doesn't weaken us, it humanizes us. When thought stops being a defense and becomes a tool, it returns to its true role, to bring clarity, not protection. And then, little by little, the soul begins to learn that feeling isn't a sign of danger, it's a sign of life. There is a kind of sensitivity that can't be learned. It comes from pain. Many who have suffered deeply develop a warm, almost intuitive presence. They know how to listen without judgment. They feel what others can't express. They know exactly where it hurts because it hurt them too. These are the ones Jung would call wounded healers, echoing the archetype of Chiron, the centaur from Greek mythology who, though wounded, could heal others. But this ability to soothe others doesn't always come from a resolved place. Sometimes it's born from an unconscious attempt to heal in someone else what still bleeds within. It's a beautiful impulse, but also a dangerous one because it can lead to self-forgetting. Caring for others becomes the priority. One's own pain is postponed. Suffering is used as a bridge to the other, but never as a path back inward. The wounded healer archetype is ambiguous. It holds both power and vulnerability. The power to turn pain into real empathy, and the vulnerability of hiding behind the caregiver role. It's as if, by offering presence to others, they avoid confronting their own absence. And that's why, so often, those who care for everyone feel secretly alone. Jung understood this trap well. He knew the psyche seeks balance, and that excessive outward care can reflect inward neglect. When the act of consoling comes with exhaustion, silent irritation, or a feeling of invisibility, it's a sign that the archetype is out of balance. Healing here doesn't mean stopping the care, but including yourself in it. It's accepting that another's pain can touch yours but shouldn't swallow it. That listening outward must come with listening inward. You can be present, but you're not obligated to carry everything. Turning the wound into awareness is what makes the wounded healer a transformative presence for themselves and others. When this internal shift happens, care stops being an escape and becomes a choice. Not because you need to save someone, but because you've learned to walk with your own pain and therefore know how to respect someone else's. Expecting less can seem like maturity, but sometimes it's just self-protection. When someone has been repeatedly let down, lied to, or neglected, hope becomes dangerous. Creating expectations feels like a risk. So to avoid being disappointed again, the soul starts to shield itself, expects little, wants less, anticipates the worst. And behind this strategy, there's a pain that still hasn't been processed. This way of living may feel safe, but it's limiting. Because in reducing expectations to avoid pain, you also reduce your openness to life. Relationships lose depth, dreams stop being freely imagined, caution replaces excitement, and any potential joy is shadowed by the fear of loss. Jung said the soul seeks expansion. That means at its core the psyche wants to grow, to experience, to create, to love. But when it's been marked by deep disappointment, it pulls back, not because it doesn't want more, but because it's not sure it can handle another fall. In this case, low expectations are a symptom of someone who once waited for something that never came. It's important to understand this isn't weakness, it's defense, a kind of emotional containment built to protect psychic integrity. But when this mechanism hardens, life starts to happen only halfway. Possibilities get filtered through fear, and everything outside your control is seen as a threat. Becoming aware of this pattern is the first step towards softening it. It's not about returning to blind hope, but about slowly allowing hope to exist without needing certainty. Realizing you can desire something without falling apart if it doesn't happen. That opening your heart doesn't mean exposing yourself recklessly, but it also doesn't mean avoiding connection altogether. Regaining hope isn't naive, it's courage. The courage to admit that despite everything, you still want to live truthfully, even knowing life offers no guarantees. And that beneath the scars, there's still a part of you that wants to feel, to engage, to dream. Because it's in that openness, however small, that the soul begins to expand again, and with it, life too. Not all pain ends when the event is over. Some experiences keep echoing inside, even years later, not because someone insists on suffering, but because something there was never processed, never digested, never closed. In these cases, the past isn't just a memory, it's a presence. And living with it, clinging to your skin, feels like walking around with open wounds no one else can see. Only the one carrying it knows its weight. Jung said, "What we resist persists." And few things are as resisted as psychological grief. Not the grief of death itself, but the grief of what never happened. The love that didn't last, the affection that wasn't returned, the childhood that was missing, the words that never came, the things that could have been but weren't. These invisible losses create inner chains that keep us tied to what's gone, but still hold power over us. The ego often tries to move forward without looking back. It creates strategies of denial, minimization, and rationalization. But the soul doesn't move in a hurry. It needs time, space, truth. Psychic grief only happens when there's room to feel, without judgment, without explanation, without the rush to get over it. Letting go of the past doesn't mean forgetting. It means integrating. It's looking at what happened and recognizing, this happened, it marked me, it hurt. And now I can let it find a place within me that is no longer an open wound, but a recognized memory. It's not erasing. It's turning a scar into something that no longer bleeds but still tells a story. This process is often painful because it forces the ego to stop pretending everything's fine. It brings the soul face to face with the real loss, the one buried under years of denial. But only when that grief is allowed can the past stop repeating itself in the present. Only then do old patterns loosen their grip. Only then do past pains stop bleeding into new experiences. Fighting the past is staying stuck in it. Letting it go is a quiet act of courage. It means saying, I accept what was, but I don't need to live from that anymore. And in that act, something dissolves. Not because it disappears, but because it finally finds its place. A place where it can exist without taking over. When grief is done, the present becomes real, and the future, at last, stops being a reflection of what hurt and becomes a true space for creation.